From Matthew 15, this woman in the story, she comes to Jesus because her daughter is suffering, and she begs him for help. And Jesus appears to ignore her, and then she keeps asking. And then Jesus says something that makes us all extremely uncomfortable. The children's bread shouldn't be thrown to the dogs. Okay, most people in the pulpit will never let somebody read this verse, let alone talk about it twice. But that's just my bag. I always add the parts of the lectionary back in that they cut out. I think those are the best parts. You don't need the same sermons on repeat every 3 years. Sometimes we need to talk about the things that strike us odd. I love Phyllis Tribble's Texts of Terror. It is certainly the most impactful work I've largely read on, I guess, what is second wave literary feminist scripture study. And I really can't argue with many of her points because she's smarter than me. I love Princeton Theological Seminary's longstanding genius F.F. Bruce. Bruce's students kindly helped assemble an entire book based on the questions that students stayed after class to ask him, and then they recorded all the answers that the professor gave. I also love his other great work, The Hard Sayings of the Bible, where he addresses just these verses. So just so you know, I will pilfer and steal from these works from this point on. And don't blame me if I get it wrong. What exactly is Matthew trying to show us in these very odd readings? I think this story is about much, much more than just whether or not Jesus is going to heal somebody's daughter. I usually try not to be too blunt, but honestly, this story is perhaps a bit more about, or at least also about, what happens when the people who are the very closest to Jesus decide that some other person doesn't belong in the group. And I suspect that I, and also perhaps sometimes we, do that kind of thing all the time, and maybe without noticing it, likely sometimes intentionally, while also feeling maybe justified or proud about how we've kept the evil person out. Who is the alienated? Who's the outsider? Who do we want to keep out? Who deserves to be alienated and talked about? Who isn't really worthy to be at the table? Who doesn't deserve the crumbs? That question makes this story really uncomfortable, not just because of what Jesus says, but because of what the disciples, the followers of Jesus, think they're supposed to say. The woman, she comes to Jesus and she starts by saying, "Lord, have mercy on me." And the disciples see her and they want to send her away. They say, "Send her away." And I think Matthew wants us to notice a difference, because the woman is not the only person being tested in the story. The disciples, and he's one of them, they are being exposed too. And so am I, and so are we. Jesus has just had this odd confrontation with the Pharisees about what makes somebody clean or unclean. It's a ceremonial idea. And the Pharisees are concerned about the external religious practices, washing hands, following the traditions, maintaining specific boundaries, and being visibly different and identifiable in a way that sinners are not. And they did this by the clothing that they wear, the makeup that they do or do not wear, if they cover their faces, what kind of coverings they might put over their hair, how they walked, who they walked with, who they sat next to when they ate, how they spoke, who they spoke with, and so on. And like little kids tattling on the other child in class, they come up to the teacher, Jesus, and they point out Jesus' friends didn't wash their hands before lunch. Ew, people say. They eat with their hands instead of cutlery, or today's Western manners, or whatever silly thing we can come up with to think of our neighbors as different. By the way, Ethiopians make some of the best food in the world precisely because they don't have much to work with. And if anybody here ever wants to go out for Ethiopian food, just let Maddie or me know, and we'll be there. Just know that we will all eat with our hands. As a side note, I'm rather convinced that most delicious food comes from the poorest places in the world because they have no other option but to make it taste good. But back to Matthew. This whole thing is a trap. The Pharisees don't really care that much about this particular custom at this point in history. They simply intend to embarrass the others for being different and for being less sophisticated than they are. So Jesus tells these little tattletales that what truly defiles a person and makes them dirty comes from the inside. The evil things that come out of the humans through their mouths and not the things that go in. Truly awful things happen not because we eat the wrong way or the wrong food, but because we think and therefore we eventually say the wrong things about people that we shouldn't. And then Matthew immediately takes Jesus out of this scenario and into another land where everyone is unclean. And so they walk off into the Gentile territory. They head north into what's present-day Lebanon. And they have 2 cities in this very cosmopolitan, rich area. And they make a point, Matthew does, of him going through the first city and then having this event take place in the second, so that you know they are thoroughly entrenched in a Gentile area. It's not an area that's mixed at all. These were Gentile cities just north of Galilee. For a Jewish audience, this is foreign territory, and it's quite dangerous. And these people were both viewed as dirty and unruly, unclean. But the people in the land Jesus sees, he's visiting their area. And they think he's dirty and unclean. They don't like the silly Hebrews, and they think they're country bumpkins. And this is a clash of cultures taking place between people who previously had a war. It's a little like someone from Singapore maybe visiting the deep south in Mississippi and probably assuming the worst for no other reason than a regional accent or preconceived notions they'd never experienced but still believe. Those people are like this. These were not their people, not their kind of people and not theirs. These were not people of the covenant from the other side. They're outsiders. And into this territory comes this woman, and she has no name because she's every woman. Across these cultures, women were almost always abused in one fashion or another. Both sides share, or at least should share, a certain amount of shame in how they thought about women in these cultures. She really shouldn't be around these men at all. And these are people of their time and their region, and we have to expect them to behave that way. Matthew deliberately puts a mean little note in his gospel. He makes sure that he calls her a Canaanite woman. And that's a strange word to use because by Jesus' day, they didn't call them Canaanites anymore. Canaanites really didn't exist. It wasn't a real ethnic designation. It was just a collection of a bunch of different people groups living in one area. Matthew reaches back into Israel's history, and he's using this name associated with ancient times in Israel to make his Jewish audience remember that she's supposed to be dirty. Matthew is making a point. He's trying to make it clear that these 2 groups meeting together are not the same. Instead, they are historic enemies of each other. Now, Mark tells this exact same story. And Mark, on the other hand, when he tells the story, has a slightly quicker version of it. Matthew steals his word immediately because Matthew has a copy of Mark. Mark calls her a Syrophoenician. She's a Syrophoenician woman, which is actually accurate for what she would be at that time and place. She's one of a group of different ethnic groups all living just north of the Israeli border. In this case, like with many, Mark, and more often Luke, is giving history, but Matthew, when he tells the story, or John, when he tells the story, they're not so much giving the history as they are trying to explain the history. Matthew, however, he refers to her as a Canaanite, making sure that the audience understands that she is, like eating with unwashed hands, equally gross to the Hebrews, like Jesus and the disciples were just the religious elite. We shifted from the Pharisees calling people dirty to the disciples doing it. Either way, Matthew wants us to understand something about his life when this event took place. He calls her the Canaanite. But Matthew also wants us to understand the lesson that he's learned along the way as he has become more like Christ, because he's been one of the bad actors. And so, how does he end his book? He ends it with Jesus sending people out for all the nations. But at the time, she is an outsider to Matthew. When he is in the moment, he sees her as dirty. She isn't one of them. She isn't a Hebrew. She is not Jewish. She doesn't belong to the people Jesus has come to save, at least first. And yet she comes to him. She comes begging to this itinerant preacher, a Jewish guy wandering around in the desert with 12 buddies. And she comes to him. And if you were her, would you not also? Any parent in the world would do exactly what she is doing. Anyone. Every parent would do this. Embarrass themselves, cross a cultural barrier, try a silly long shot, an experimental drug. Read over, think over, pray over, ultimately seek out a miracle from somewhere or someone. Every parent is this woman, every single one. And so every parent here understands the basics of this story. This is a hurting, tear-filled person who has a daughter who is suffering terribly in some fashion. Matthew writes that this woman claims her child is being tormented by a demon. And we should be careful about trying to force an ancient description into modern medical categories. The ancient world didn't have distinctions between psychiatry, neurology, epilepsy, and a lot of other conditions. I don't say this because I don't believe in tormenting spirits. I actually do. I say this because I don't believe that's the only point. The point is very clear. She is tormented in some way. She is sick, and she needs healing. Her child is suffering, and she's desperate. And she's heard about this Jesus fellow, a teacher. And maybe she's heard stories about things that he's done that excite her. And so she comes to him, and she cries out in a very unique way, especially for a Syrophoenician woman. She starts with the word Lord. It's sort of like saying sir, but it's also master. Lord, and then she follows that up with son of David. Son of David. I think that's a really remarkable kind of a statement coming from her. A Gentile woman calling a Jewish teacher a master and a son of David. She's asking Israel's Savior or Messiah, the son of David, for mercy. And then Matthew gives us one of the strangest sentences in all of the Gospels. Jesus did not answer her at all. He says nothing. Have you ever prayed, even over a sick child, and heard nothing? Not no, not wait, just nothing. Feel that moment in your life. That is where this woman is. And she cries out, and then Jesus is quiet. And we don't know why. There are different ways that Christians and scholars have understood this passage. Perhaps the silence is drawing out her faith, giving her time to express herself. Perhaps it allows the disciples' attitudes to become visible as they start to interject. Perhaps Matthew is showing us the tension between this particular priority of Jesus' mission to Israel and all of the things that happened to him on the way to fulfill that mission. But Matthew doesn't really tell us. We don't have an explanation. There's no interpolation note here where it says, and because of this, Jesus did this and this is why. It just tells us he was silent. So we shouldn't pretend that we know more about this text than it actually tells us. What we do know is this: Jesus doesn't send her away. The conversation continues, and eventually Jesus praises her faith. So I don't think Matthew wants us to read the silence as evidence that Jesus doesn't care about her, because that's not where the story goes. Instead, the silence seems to create a question. Will the outsider be turned away? Is she unclean? And the answer ultimately is no. But before we get to that, I think we have to deal with these disciples. The woman is crying out, and the disciples say, "Send her away, for she is crying out after us too much." Notice they don't say, "Let's help her." They don't say, "This is a suffering child." They don't say, "Jesus, can you do something?" They say, "Send her away." And isn't that revealing? For the disciples, the problem isn't that there's a suffering child, it's that there's a loud mother. The problem is the woman, the Gentile. She's a female approaching a man in public. It makes her look like a prostitute. She is persistent. She's causing a scene. She's loud. She is uncontrollable. She's outside of their religious and cultural boundaries, and she's making them feel awkward. So they want her gone. And this is where the story starts to get very contemporary, because we do the same thing. And we may not always look at a person who's different from us and say, "We'll send them away," but we might say it and say it differently. We're not really that kind of group, or this isn't the sort of church built for that. Or more likely, we just present ourselves in a way that says it without saying it. You wouldn't maybe fit in our group. You don't really understand how things work here. You might make people uncomfortable. You have a lot of baggage. You're too political, or not enough political. They won't be able to contribute, or they're too wealthy. They want to control things, or the whole family is involved in this. They don't dress quite right, have the wrong kind of hair or shoes. They don't talk quite right. They have accents. They don't worship quite right. They lift their hands or won't lift them. They don't believe exactly 100% all the time what we think we believe. And we might never say, "Send them away," but sometimes we can communicate that. And the uncomfortable thing about this passage is that the people who are saying, "Send her away," are not the Pharisees. It's not the Sadducees and the religious elite. It's not the conservative Pharisees teaching people to follow extra laws. It's the disciples of Jesus. It's his 12 best friends. It's the closest people to him. It's people who have been traveling for 3 years, hearing him teach every day. The woman is not the only person who is tested in her faith here. The disciples are tested, and they are exposed. And so Jesus finally speaks, and he says, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel," which is sort of like saying no, but not saying no. And it's an important statement, because Jesus is actually telling the truth about his priority for his mission. Israel has been waiting for their Messiah. Israel has received promises and scriptures about what the Messiah is and what the Messiah does. Israel has been preparing for this moment throughout the story of Scripture. They expect him. Jesus' mission begins with them. But that doesn't mean Gentiles don't matter at all. Matthew's gospel eventually ends with Jesus telling his disciples to go and make disciples of all the nations of the earth. And Matthew is not within himself worried about the Gentiles. His whole book is about the Jews, and about how Jesus is better than Moses and is the promised one. So the fact that he ends with this sending out to the Gentiles shows that Matthew has changed quite a lot from this story to his last story. There is movement here from Israel to the nations. The mission begins with Israel, but it does not end with Israel. And this woman somehow finds her way standing right in the middle of all of this tension in the Bible. And she's been told, in effect, that the mission isn't directly towards people like her, but she refuses to walk away. And then comes the really hard part of the story, the part that will definitely get cut out of the lectionary readings most mornings. Jesus says, "It is not right to take the bread away from the children and toss it to the dogs." Did you all catch that when it was read? And did it make you cringe just a little? We shouldn't pretend that this verse doesn't make us uncomfortable, because it's pretty uncomfortable. Jesus is actually using a very common image within the children representing Israel and dogs representing Gentiles or outsiders. This was a very common phrase at the time. And the word Jesus uses is different. Although people would refer to non-Jews as dogs, they meant a different kind of dog, a large, wild animal, a cur, as sometimes translated. Jesus uses a different Greek word, not for a scavenger, but something that the Hebrews didn't ever use when they said this. That distinction matters quite a bit, but it doesn't erase the tension. The word that he uses actually stands for the rare dog that was a pet at the time, usually small little lap dogs. So he does call her a dog, but it's not in the mean way that is usually meant, but it's still uncomfortable, right? It's still awkward for us in our culture to hear. The thing is, though, the woman doesn't get upset. She doesn't seem bothered by it at all. She sort of agrees with what he's saying, whatever that means. So she doesn't deny anything, and she doesn't argue. She doesn't say, well, I'm not an outsider, I'm not a dog. She doesn't demand anything. You have no right to say that to me. He's in her land. Instead, she takes Jesus' own analogy and she uses it for herself. She takes Jesus' own words and she says, "Yes, Lord," calling him master again. "Yet even the dogs," and she uses the pet word, "eat the crumbs that fall from the master's tables." It's an extraordinary statement from a woman in pain. She doesn't even need the whole meal, she says. She doesn't demand to take Israel's place or be the first that he comes to. She simply believes that there is enough mercy in the cup that overflows that it means Jesus is also there for her. And that's when Jesus says, "Woman, you are a woman of great faith," and the daughter is healed. So do you see what happened? The woman who's supposed to be the outsider, the alienated one, the one that nobody wants, becomes the person in the story who has the greatest faith. And the friends of Jesus become the people that try to turn her away. They're the ones saying, "Send her off." The people who thought that they belonged are the ones struggling to recognize the heart of the God they claim to follow. The woman came to Jesus because she knew she needed mercy. The disciples were too close to Jesus, and they'd forgotten that they needed mercy in the first place too. And that might be one of the more uncomfortable things about discipleship, for the disciples and for us as disciples. You can be very close to Jesus and also be very, very far from his heart. You can know the scriptures. You can belong to the church. You can know the songs. You can sing real loud. You can understand the traditions. You can explain things to others. You can have the right Sunday school answers and still look at somebody else and think, "Ooh, send them away." So this story forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. Who makes you uncomfortable? Who do you wish would stop making things difficult on your life or interfering in your moments? Who is the person whose presence changes the atmosphere in the room for you? Who's the person we would rather serve from a distance or send money to than sit next to or talk to? Who's the person that we secretly think would be better off finding another group to meet with? Who doesn't look like us or speak like us or worship like us or talk like us or vote like us? Who doesn't come from the same background as us? Who doesn't have the same history as we do? Who have we quietly decided doesn't belong at the table and wants sent away? Because that is the story, that is the biggest question in the story. It's not simply, Who is Jesus willing to help? But it's also who are we willing to welcome or exclude? And here's the thing, before we decide who belongs at the table, we need to remember how we got there. Because none of us came because we were good enough. And none of us came because we belonged more than someone else. And none of us came because we had the right background or the right story or the right family or the right belief system or the right record. We came because of grace and mercy. And we came because we were invited. We are all here because somebody made room for us. And the woman in the story knows that. She doesn't come demanding her rights. She comes asking for mercy. And Jesus commends her faith. So perhaps the final question isn't, who is this Canaanite woman in our world? Perhaps the more uncomfortable question is, who do we want to send away? Because the person we want to send away may well be the very person through whom Jesus is teaching us something about welcoming and our faith. And the outsiders often see something the insiders have forgotten. And if Jesus has made room for us at his table, then we had better be very, very, very careful about telling someone else there isn't a chair for them. The story is still a little uncomfortable, but I hope you struggle with it all week. Amen.